Within many of the concentration camps established under the Third Reich, women were employed as guards and in other roles to keep order and oversee the day-to-day running of the camps. Many of these women, along with the men, regularly involved themselves in the barbaric treatment of prisoners at camps such as Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and across many other sites in Nazi-occupied territory. Guards were noted for their horrific treatment, for example regularly beating and whipping prisoners for no such reason, or to help improve work output. There were famous women such as Irma Grayes, who was known for her barbarism, and eventually after the Second World War, she faced justice being sentenced to death for taking part in selections at the camps, and also brutally beating women with her whip. Some guards, including Grazer, were also accused of murdering prisoners in cold blood. Jenny Barkmann was another one of these women, who found herself facing the hangman's gallows for her involvement in the Holocaust. So join us today as we look at the justified execution of Jenny Barkmann, the beautiful Spectre. And remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Jenny Barkmann was born on the 30th of May 1922 in Hamburg, within the Weimar Republic. Very little is known about her early life, and it's assumed that in fact she had a rather normal childhood and upbringing attending school. It's also assumed that she had a rather normal life within Hamburg, as Hitler seized control of Germany. However, at some point she decided to transition into a rather brutal and sadistic line of work. In 1944, as the Second World War was turning against the Nazis, Jenny Barkmann joined Stutthof Concentration Camp, and she became an Aufseherin, a female guard. Now, of 55,000 guards who worked within the concentration camps, 3,700 of them were women. The first female guards arrived at Auschwitz and Majdanek from Ravensbrück in 1942. Ravensbrück at the time was the main female concentration camp of the Holocaust. However, the Nazis in 1943 began to conscript women into the concentration camp system because at the time there was a shortage of guards. Women became Aufseherins, overseers or attendants, and they were generally from the lower or middle classes. The Nazis weren't picky and took any woman without any relevant work experience, and many came from completely different lines of work, for example retired teachers or hairdressers. Volunteers were recruited via newspaper advertisements, and these asked women to show their love for the Third Reich and to join the SS retinue for women. Some women were alternatively conscripted into the camps, and there was even enrolment from the League of German Girls, a youth group which girls joined. Jenny Barkmann arrived at Stutthof Concentration Camp in 1944. It was a camp established by the Nazis in a marsh area east of the city of Danzig. Following the invasion of Poland, the camp was set up and it was initially used as a place to house Polish prisoners, and it was the first camp set up outside the borders of Germany. Interestingly, it was also the last camp liberated by the Allies. However, inside Stutthof's gates and walls, much of the same horrors of the Holocaust occurred. It's estimated that around 65,000 prisoners died within Stutthof and the subcamps due to murder, starvation, outbreaks of disease and illness, being forced to work incredibly hard, a lack of medical supervision, and also being forced on death marches. Over 110,000 people were deported to the camp, and it's estimated that around 28,000 Jews were executed inside. A number of prisoners who found themselves there came from many different countries, and many of the prisoners were members of the Polish underground. The conditions were in particular horrendous, with thousands of prisoners dying of disease and starvation. There were many typhus epidemics that swept across the camps, and the SS guards judged those who were weak or sick and sent them straight into the gas chambers within the camp. Executions began there in January 1940, and the gassings began using Zyklon B in 1944, and prisoners inside Stutthof were often clubbed and beaten to death or even drowned in mud, such were the horrific conditions. There was also lots of forced labour, and many German companies utilised inmates to work in their workshops and factories. There was even an allegation at Stutthof that corpses from the camp were used in creating soap. Now, Jenny Barkmann was transferred across to Stutthof in 1944, and the guards were expected to be ruthless with their treatment of the prisoners. However, within Stutthof, she became known for her awful cruelty and barbarism. She regularly brutalised prisoners, often to death. Barkmann got stuck into her work at the camp and often beat victims to death to strike fear into the hearts of other inmates. She was also regularly involved in the selection processes at the camp, selecting those who were not fit enough to go to work and sending them straight to their deaths within the gas chambers. She sent many women and children straight to their deaths, and for her brutality she became known as a beautiful Spectre. Her actions inside the concentration camps were only too familiar with guards, and as the Second World War came to an end, Barkmann tried to flee to escape her fate. She hid in Gdansk, which at the time was besieged, and she decided to go under a false name to try and become undetected and escape. However, in May 1945, she was identified and finally arrested. Now, along with other criminals and guards who worked at Stutthof, she was placed on trial in 1946. Poland held 4 trials overall for the former guards who worked there, and they were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. The first trial, held in Gdansk, saw Barkmann along with 12 other defendants, including 6 female guards, face their fate in evidence. Jenny Barkmann, throughout her trial, did not show any remorse. It was said during her imprisonment that she was mostly concerned with her appearance, wearing a different hairstyle for each day of the trial, and she allegedly even flirted with the prison guards. It was also noted how throughout the trial she giggled and laughed repeatedly and was more bothered with her hair. Along with 10 other defendants, Jenny Barkmann was sentenced to death for her crimes of the Holocaust, and she was to be executed by hanging. On the 4th of July 1946, Soviet officials working in occupied Poland led the condemned out of their prison cells and took them to the Biskupa Gorka Hill near to Gdansk. A huge crowd had gathered of around 200,000 to see the execution of the condemned, including Barkmann. She wore a simple dress, and at around 5 p.m. she was stood under the gallows. Then Barkmann was placed onto a truck, and her hands were tied around her back and her ankles also tied together. The hangman then placed the noose around her neck, and final preparations were made for her execution. She stood there facing the huge crowds, and then suddenly the truck drove away. Jenny Barkmann had nothing to stand on, and because of this she was left hanging in front of the crowd. She was there dangling, and she twitched her hands and feet together and lost one shoe as she struggled for breath. She then turned limp and was one of the first of those executed before the other condemned were executed that day. Jenny Barkmann was only just 24 years old when she was executed. In what was very common during the Holocaust, many of the SS guards, in particular the women, were very young when they committed the horrendous crimes that they became infamous for at the concentration camps. It was clear that they were brainwashed by the ways of Hitler, and they must have believed within the camps they were doing the right thing, inflicting torture and barbarism onto the innocent prisoners. Jenny Barkmann was just one of many war criminals. However, a large number were never brought to justice. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.